We'll look at the China's economy after COVID. So let me play you a news discussion on the Chinese news channel, and then we'll have our own discussion.
China's economy is surging ahead. We will take a look at the numbers and how China's experience can drive the world's recovery. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. China was the first country hit by the coronavirus and suffered a huge economic slowdown at the beginning of the year. But with COVID-19 under control, Beijing has been able to stage a strong recovery. Its GDP for the third quarter grew 4.9% compared to the same period last year, making China the only major economy to post a significant rebound following the pandemic slump. We start with CGTN's Sun Yi from Beijing.
A solid rebound. Authorities say the GDP jump shows the country's economy is steadily recovering lost ground. Thanks to the boost, the first 9 months of 2020 now amount to a slight 0.7% growth rate compared to last year.
Economic growth for the first 3 quarters shifted from negative to positive. Relations between supply and demand have improved, and the vitality of market economy has been enhanced. The national economy has continued steady recovery.
MBS says retail sales have risen for 2 months in a row, registering a hard-won 3.3% growth in September. Liu said Chinese consumers are regaining confidence as shown in their willingness to trade up and spend on non-essentials. Sales in cosmetics and jewelry items both saw 2-digit growth in September.
We've seen the figures coming from the Golden Week holiday too. Dining out, tourism, and other spending are all recovering. We've seen household consumption steadily rise and making an ever bigger consumption to GDP. We look at the massive Chinese market and we believe the potential is huge. The growth of the domestic market will also contribute to the global recovery.
Officials say with market demand, investment, and manufacturing all on the right track, China's recovery and growth would continue through the end of this year. The IMF expects China to be the only major economy to grow in 2020, projecting a growth rate of 1.9%. Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
To explain that growth, let's bring in our panelists from Beijing. Aina Tangen is a current affairs commentator. Also from Beijing via Skype, John Gong is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. On this side of the Pacific in Irvine, California, Dan McClory is managing director and head of China for Bosted Securities. And William Lee is chief economist at the Milken Institute, joining us right here in Washington, D.C. via Skype. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Aina Tangen, as we just heard, GDP grew by 4.9% in the third quarter in China compared to the same period last year. Not as high as analysts had been expecting, but still a significant amount of growth and the only major economy in the world to show this kind of growth. What did you make of it?
Well, I think the real story here is about confidence. You're starting to see Chinese consumers. They really believe that their government had the right solution, not only to COVID-19 in terms of the health, but also in terms of the economics. And you can clearly see that. The willingness to buy property, which was up 12%, to buy automobiles, also up 12%. The real gains versus last year in sales. This really speaks to China getting back on track. And as I said, this comes down to consumer confidence. If I'm not confident, I don't spend. So Chinese consumers are definitely on the road.
Fair to say then, Aina, that was driven largely by consumer demand in China.
Well, yes, but there was also production was up over almost 6%. And this is very positive. You've seen real increases in terms of exports. China seems to be the only working economy. And as a result, it's supplying the rest of the world with much needed parts, PPE, you name it. if you, including these kind of chemicals that are necessary for almost all the processes, including creating medicines and things like that, you're seeing a real big export boom. Give you an example, India. If you go back to May, June, since that time, the amount of exports to India has actually increased 4 times. The U.S. over this year, over 4 years, is up 25%. So, China does have markets out there. You could expect some real changes with the Biden administration taking tariffs off, and that's going to even fuel a larger boom as China continues to be the low-cost center for export.
John Gong, looking at some of the other numbers, the jobless rate fell to 5.4%. That's lower than the month before and lower than the government's target of 6%. We also had retail sales that were up 3.3%. Looking at these numbers, are they sustainable, do you think?
Well, I think things are getting better. I think the economy is definitely on course to come back, even though the third quarter number, 4.9%, is a little bit, just a little bit below my expectation. I was expecting something, maybe north of 5%. I think what's happening here is that overall, the production side is really coming back. But just to be on the conservative side, I think, on the consumption side, there are still room for improvement. I think, there's a little bit of weakness. And I think we need to point out, and I totally agree with Angus' very optimistic assessment, my friend. But I think just to play the devil's advocate here, I think on the consumption side, it's actually no economy is immune to what candidate Biden was saying, that there's kind of a K-shaped recovery phenomenon going on. I think in virtually every country. Historically, after a very large natural disaster or pandemic like this, the economic recovery is always like that. I mean, there's always a distributional effect here that the rich people, the rich countries are doing much, much better than the poor people in poor countries. And I think same things happening here in China. Although I think that the central government is trying to push those very large infrastructure projects and other investments as part of fiscal policy. And I think the money is starting to percolate down, but it's going to take some time for this investment to percolate down to benefit, the less wealthy people, the working class people, and such that we have to wait some time for these people to get income into their hands, and so that they can start to spend. Right. And I think it's going to be some time for that.
John, just one point on what you said there, and that is a K-shaped recovery. I mean, the conventional view is that this is a V-shaped recovery, but a K-shaped recovery, one group going up, one group going down. Break that down for us. Who's going up? Who's going down?
Well, definitely the well-off people, the people who have money in hands, people who have good jobs, they're doing very well. Now, I'm not saying that the poor people or the less wealthy people are going down, but I think in China, it takes some time for them to recover. I don't mean to say that here in China that we have a second group of people actually they're going down. No, they're not going down. They're being helped by the government. But look at the employment figures, I think the employment figures is actually coming back or recovering quite slowly. And certainly, the people who are, really working in the service industries, who are just trying to make ends meet, really the working class people, it's going to take some time for them to fully recover to the level that prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, Dan McClory, an analyst at Moody's Analytics, had this to say about these numbers coming out of China. He said that China was able to grow as fast as it did, given the weakness all across the rest of the global economy right now. That fact, he said, was quite remarkable. When we look at, the Chinese economy, and we know that all economies are interconnected, China's economy to a large extent up to now has been an export-oriented economy. How did China achieve that, given that world demand is still not there?
It's a great question. I think there's two sides to this, and you brought up the first one, which was, how does China compare to the rest of the world? We heard about the IMF number, growth of 1.9% for the year. What's it going to be in the U.S.? A decline of 4.3. What's the Eurozone look like? A decline of 8.3. So first of all, these are tremendously higher rates of growth than any of the other industrialized economies are predicting. But the answer to the second part of your question is there's a three-phase plan. So what did China do? Late January, almost total shutdown. Economy, everything. That last quarter through middle or the end of March. Then what did they do? Started the factories back up. To your point about export. Let's get the factories moving. At least we can have that engine hopefully come back to life. And then finally, now what we've seen in Q3 is a consumer came back. And some of that's pent-up demand. Some of that was disposable income that was being saved or worried about. And who knows how repeatable it's going to be. But I think it was a very premeditated three-phased approach through Qs 1, 2, and 3 that got China where it is today.
It gets back down to something I was talking about earlier on, in that, is this sustainable? Because if we're looking at, for instance, the IMF projections for next year, which is over 8% growth, is that going to be possible if, as you point out, there are slowdowns in both the United States and in the Eurozone?
Very difficult given that. I think the other economies are not exhibiting signs of such a robust return to growth yet. So it's extremely tough to be able to predict that. But I'll tell you one sector of the Chinese economy that's also booming, that's not looked at a lot, and that's financial services, the world we live in every day in investment banking. I don't know if you realize it or not, but the Chinese stock markets, that's Shenzhen and Shanghai combined, hit an all-time high of $10 trillion in total market cap. That's up a third just from January alone. More than $100 billion a day trades just on the Shenzhen exchange. It's bigger than Seoul, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. So this is massive. The financial services industry is really moving along, and we also see it in exports. You know, one of the biggest Chinese exports that we never hear about are IPOs, initial public offerings. This year is at an all-time record pace, according to Goldman Sachs. There have been $9 billion raised in Chinese IPOs in New York alone, $8 billion in follow-on offerings. And by the way, 2/3 of that is money from China. Maybe 1/3 is from American investors. And Chinese stocks in the last 12 months are up 50%, those stocks that are traded in the U.S., compared to the S&P 500 is only up 25%.
Okay, William Lee, let's look at it another way. Looking at these Chinese figures, could China be the driver for global growth, especially in Asia?
I'm glad you asked that question. I think I have to bring back a word of caution here, because as much as China's production has really been so strong, as we've already mentioned, much of the strength also came from infrastructure and a policy directive toward boosting domestic demand. Unlike 2008, where a lot of the stimulus went to consumers, consumers actually bought goods and services from the rest of the world and acted as a global locomotive. Much of the stimulus this time is going to incentivizing factories to restart, incentivizing infrastructure spending, and much of that stays at home. So the possibility of China becoming a locomotive for growth is really much more limited this time. And I would say that a lot of the consumption patterns, the composition of consumption, has also been primarily toward luxury goods and domestic luxury goods, because most of us were very surprised by how slow actually consumption actually took off, considering there was actually no international travel. So whatever would have been spent abroad was spent at home. And despite that, the consumers were still a bit cautious, so that their spending is still about, 30% shy of what it was last year to date. So there's a lot of hesitation on the part of the private sector in China to really carry on the kind of locomotive that it used to have to play in the past.
So, William, what do you think needs to happen then in the year ahead?
I think one of the things that China has to do, of course, is to restore its role as an integral part of the global supply chain, and much of the policy tensions that have come about even before the COVID-19 hit has to be addressed, about trade agreements, having a framework where the trade and services and intellectual property protection has to be established. So these are the sort of the old priorities that have to be brought back into gear again, because China and the U.S. are the two largest economies in the world, and we need to develop a framework for trade in the 21st century. Until that happens, the kind of spats and sparring that goes on between the two countries is certainly not going to be helpful for encouraging global growth.
Anna Tangen, looking, William Lee just mentioned global supply chains. You look at China's exports, they represent 17% of the country's economy. That's double what U.S. exports represent to its economy. And President Xi Jinping has been talking about self-reliance. How does China lessen its dependence on these overseas markets?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it's going to be a lessened dependence because China has to import a lot of its basic goods. I mean, the raw materials, whether it's oil or ore or whatever, in order to sustain not only its exports, but its internal markets. So when you talk about China being a driver of the economy, it's a lot about these raw materials, whether it's food to energy. So I would just see that a little bit differently from my colleague. Also, just please note that retail sales year over year are up for the entire year, almost 1%, 0.9%. So that you've seen a real increase in consumption. There are worries around, especially with debt and unemployment, bad loans, etc. But the confidence that's going forward is really quite extraordinary. And what I'm not hearing is people talking about what the changes are going to be, assuming that the White House does in fact change and Biden comes in with a completely different economic game plan, which is going to, I believe, favor China, especially in the short run. It will return to being the low-cost provider, and in that kind of scenario, you're going to see exports jump.
Dan, what is your view on that? Should Biden win the election and become president, do you think the tariffs will go away?
I think Trump has an outstanding chance of winning the election, just for the record. So Biden clearly is perceived to be less confrontational, more globalist in nature. So I wouldn't be surprised if he embarks on a strategy like that. But let's face it, China actually wants to get out of the manufacturing business. This is not the long-term strategy for China. It's about services and it's about consumers. And so they have to replace that manufacturing business with something. We've just heard how import dependent it is for at least raw materials, for global supply chains, shipping in components that are perhaps assembled in China and then sold to the rest of the world. So this is not the be-all and the end-all for China. I do think Biden would be more conciliatory towards China and would embrace more some of the patterns of his predecessors. But, Trump's not out of it yet by a long shot.
Yeah. John, looking at the levels of trade, I mean, if we look at Chinese imports, China importing iron ore, that's grown. Soybeans and iron ore from Brazil. It's also importing corn and pork from the United States. What kind of impact is that having on these two countries?
Well, I think it's particularly important for countries like, resource-rich countries like, Australia and Canada. And to some extent, United States as well. We buy a lot of agricultural products from U.S. And supposedly energy products as well. I hope it's happening. I think, there's no doubt that China is indeed playing a global locomotive kind of a role for the rest of the world. But I do want to address, your previous question about China becoming more and more self-reliant.
Yeah.
I think Xi never said that we want to be sort of isolated from the rest of the world. What he really means is that China needs to be self-reliant in those, choke points technologies. In other words, it doesn't want the country to be held hostage to the U.S., for example, in certain areas, such that it can, just cripple the entire supply chain. Huawei is a very good example here. In semiconductor business, there are areas that that can be greatly impacted if the Department of Commerce, for example, in Washington takes actions, right? So these are the things he's talking about. And I think China is indeed moving in that direction. And this is kind of a regrettable, actually. It should have happened. In the telecommunication industry, there is division of labor and division of tasks. China is very specialized in this area. The United States is specialized. Qualcomm is specialized in other areas. But now, because of the Trump policy, this very nice equilibrium has been damaged to a great extent. And now, the Chinese companies have to take matters into their own hands. They have to develop their own technologies, which is quite unfortunate.
William, what are your thoughts on that? China does see itself as being vulnerable in certain sectors. And as John just pointed out, we saw what happened to Huawei.
The danger of China going on its own, I think, is going to be very obvious. President Xi said a very interesting speech, had a very interesting speech in Shenzhen the other day, when he said that the success of Shenzhen was to build on the dictum of Deng Xiaoping to experiment, right? To cross the river by touching the stones and to experiment and to allow failure. One of the things that he also added to that, though, was that now innovation must take care and pay attention to the center. That top-down direction toward technology is something I find very dangerous because countries that have tried that in the past, that industrial policy, whether it's Japan or Singapore, to try to direct the growth of technology, has more than not failed. And I think going forward, China has got to integrate its technology and standards with those of the rest of the world. I absolutely agree. China has a comparative advantage in a lot of the technological fields going forward. And the issue is to be able to develop standards in a way that integrates China's technology with the technology in the rest of the world. And I don't believe that Trump's policies are cutting that off. In fact, it's to protect China's intellectual property as well as America's intellectual property in a way that allows that integration to take place and allow the benefits to accrue to the developers of those technologies.
Aina, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see it the same way?
No, not at all. I mean, I've heard this tired argument before that somehow bashing China is protecting it. Quite frankly, China's success is an existential threat to a lot of people in America who believe in this kind of exceptionalism, that it's okay for the U.S. to do bad things in order to create the greater good. Very fascistic argument. And I really reject it. I think it's the wrong way to go. China has a different system, and it's been successful the last 40 years. Shenzhen, since it was mentioned, was growing at 20% GDP per year, 40 years. Imagine that. So how can you say that it's the wrong system or that somehow the U.S. has to rein in China? I think it has to be cooperation. This is a multilateral world. This thinking that somehow the U.S. has all the answers, I think, is completely wrong.
Go ahead, William.
That's a complete distortion of what I said. I said Shenzhen's success was because it was able to copy the freestyling experimentation of Hong Kong. And what I was fearing going forward was the dictum that we need to now pay attention to the implications for the overall system. That constraint on innovation is something that could kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And in fact, this is not a tired tirade on my part, because I am trying to say China's standards are to be accepted and acknowledged by the rest of the world, and its property rights are to be protected just like everybody else's property rights. Surely you can't deny that the purpose of 21st century technology is to benefit the rest of the world by integrating the rest of the world. And that's the purpose of, I think, the Trump policy and the Xi policy prior to the COVID during the talks. And the next phase was supposed to be developing standards by which we can integrate technology. Integrating technology as opposed to developing China's own technology and imposing it on the rest of the world.
All right, Dan, I want to move on.
You lost me on the idea that Trump is promoting integration.
Very quickly.
Well, I think,
Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm just going to take it back to the comment about Shenzhen. I'm here in California, Southern California, to be specific. And, I compare what's occurred in Shenzhen with what happened in California. California just took off. Innovation, creativity, for the most part, content, technology industries, some aerospace and defense. But, we've seen something similar happen here in the U.S. We've seen it occur in 40 years also in Shenzhen. Going back to President Trump and his attitude towards China, I think he's put things in about 3 different buckets. So there are things that China has, there are things that China needs, and there are things that the U.S. has. So how do those chess pieces get rearranged to the benefit, not just of China, not just of the U.S., okay? And some things President Trump would say China has, and they probably shouldn't have had them. And he'd like to see those done on a more unilateral, cooperative basis between the countries. And I think that's starting to come to pass. And maybe he took out a baseball bat a couple of times to try to affect change or to get attention. But I think you're seeing that slowly coming to pass. And you're going to start to see companies getting through CFIUS for mergers and acquisitions. You're going to see flashpoints of areas that are of great importance to either country. We heard about semiconductors before.
Right.
You know about artificial intelligence. There's a lot of sectors here. So I think the equilibrium is returning from all the banter. But I think either side has to assert itself.
Although, Dan, we do hear very confrontational rhetoric coming from this White House. I mean, part of it could be attributed to the fact that we are in the middle of an election campaign, but it tends to be hostile.
Well, it is, and it's sort of Trump's rendition of the art of the deal, right? So we have a transactional president who sees things as, who's going to make out, how is this going to happen, and who needs what I have, who has what I need, and he puts together deals.
John Gong, there has been a warning from China's Statistics Bureau. We heard from them in that report at the beginning of the show. They say the biggest threat to the Chinese economy and its continued recovery is, quote, the international environment is still complicated and severe with considerable instabilities and uncertainties. So spell that out for us. Where does China see these instabilities and uncertainties?
Well, I think the backdrop is that there's this trade war between the United States and China, and Washington's sort of structural change in its foreign policy with respect to China. And on top of this, we had this pandemic, and early on you can see there's a surge of sort of anti-China sentiments permeating in many parts of the world. Kind of a blaming China mentality here. Yeah. So this is a big challenge, and I think that maybe getting to next year with the pending prospective Biden administration, things probably will get a little bit better then. I do want to address the issue about the previously discussed. I want to have my say about the previous issue. President, addressing some of the structural issues here in China, including intellectual property rights protection, stuff like that, is probably the last thing on President Trump's mind. He's really caring about the trade deficit from U.S. perspective. Now, Robert Lighthizer may have something like this in his mind, but we have to keep in mind that some of the things addressed in that Section 301 report are indeed being addressed here in China. For example, precisely on this IPR protection issue, China has just recently passed a IPR law amendment strengthening IPR protection. We introduced the Trumbull damage system here. Right. That's the penalty of 3 times more practice in the United States. We adopted this here in China now. You're going to see more lawsuits the judge imposing more fines for violations. So I think, it's not like we're rejecting all the things coming from Robert Lighthizer, but some of the things actually we are indeed taking. And I think, from that perspective, it's actually working in that regard. Okay.
William Lee, I've just got about 20 seconds left. I've got one final question. The IMF outlook for China, as I pointed out earlier on, is 8.2%. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, as China's a locomotive, no, it won't happen. What we need to have is domestic demand be boosted in all of the individual continents like Europe and U.S. And China has to do its role in boosting domestic demand in a way that tries to improve the prospects for consumers and reduce the uncertainty that consumers face. The social safety net's absolutely vital.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
Okay. So we have see the Heat. It is part of the China. I have turned off the speaker for everybody, so I will now allow you to unmute, so you will be able to speak. So anyone want to speak, just unmute yourself and then we can discuss. Anyone want to start first?
Well, we're going to listen to you first, aren't we?
Okay. China definitely have seen a growth in its economy in the recent months. The problem now is that China is realized that the world is not growing, so it will have to depend on itself to sustain the growth. So there's a very hot phase coming out from China these days is what they call the double circulations, meaning that they want to start the economy circulating within China. And if that circulations can go outside China, it is fine as well. But they will be putting the emphasis in the Chinese domestic economy growth rather than helping the world to recover, because China see that the world won't recover until COVID is out of the way, and until there is a viable vaccines, until when people are willing to actually get the vaccines, the world economy is not coming back. So meanwhile, while China is working hard towards the vaccine, it have to keep its own economy growing. And that's where this so-called double circulation is going on. It wants to circulate the money within the Chinese domestic economy first. If there's anything that they can help, like exporting, they will. I think that is the current strategy, and whether the strategy will last how long, I don't know. But that's my take on the current situation in China. Of course, the video discussion focuses on the third quarter growth of economy and then get it from there. But I'm more looking at a more long term, in let's say the next 2 to 3 quarters. I think the world still will need some recovery before we see the world getting back.
Oh, yes. I agree.
Albert, can I ask a question? I think one of the interesting things about China is their enormous population. Now, do they still have that law that limits the number of children that people have? It used to be 1, and then they moved it to 2. Is that still in place?
2.
Yep. 2 is still in place.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Because I think one of the great things about the Chinese economy is the cheap labour. That's the top and bottom of it, That's how they can sell stuff for ridiculously low prices when nobody else can.
Well, now, for the price of labor, actually the Chinese labor cost has been going up, given China's growth. So its labor cost is going up. But in terms of supply of labor, actually there's still a large amount of labor globally. For example, Africa. We are talking about a couple of billions people there in Africa, and they are upon to provide the low-cost labor. So China, given that its population is not concentrating into the growth, China is more interested in sustaining the population rather than growing the population. So because of that, China need a different strategy from the old model. Now, when we have a model whereby we have a growing population, then we will have to think about creating jobs for the young people. But when you are thinking of a sustaining population, that means you are shifting some work towards the replacing youngs, and then you get more and more older people. That economy will be very different from an economy whereby you are expecting more young people than the old people. So what we have to look at in the next, say, 20 or 30 years is the comparison between Indian economy and the Chinese economy. Indian economy, they are still very young and they are growing, and they are going to take over China as the most populous country in the world. China is getting old.
Yeah.
So there's a very, very different strategy. I think different countries need to take that into account and say, what is my strategy to growth? Because China is not going to be the low cost producer in the long run. Eventually, the cost will be getting higher and higher. So there's no reason why the young people in China have to work as hard as their parents when the standard of living is low. But now the standard of living is rising, and therefore they need a higher pay jobs. So the Chinese economy have to change.
That's right. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things when I was there a few years ago was when they only allowed a single child.
But
and
now
they had these young children who were so spoiled, unbelievable, you know.
Yeah.
They were in an incredible situation, you know.
Well, now
so fat, and they were just, you know.
It all depends on family. When you have only one child, sometimes some parents will spoil the child, but the other parents will put all the hopes on the child and to be very strict towards the child. So that can be extreme on two ways. So we are yet to see whether the current batch of young people getting up, are they as good as we expect? So far, we see that there are still a lot of innovations from the young people. For example, a lot of the best scientists in China is now in their 40s. So that means people in their 30s, 40s are now coming up as leaders in China. That is pretty young, put it that way. I would expect, for example, in a large organizations, the top CEO would be in their 50s with that kind of experience. But we are seeing in China
talking about.
Sorry?
Go on.
I think I got the message through already. So
talking about some kids are very spoiled and others are not. This happened just after I left China, so about 7 years ago. And this is not an isolated incident, and these are the sort of things that you're always aware of when you're teaching too. This young man is exactly like you said. They put all their hope in this young man, and he went to extra classes in the evening, on the weekend, everything. He was in year 12. His father worked as something in the school, gatekeeper, I think, in the school. His mother stayed home so she could look after this boy. He didn't have to do anything except study. And one day it just got too much. He took a knife and he took it to his mother. Now his mother is in the grave, and he is in prison for 32 years. And his father is on his own, and they've all three of them missed out. And that's not an isolated case. That's the sort of stuff that goes on. Also, when you're the only child and the whole village has got together because you have qualified for even a level 3 university. And they come into university and they daren't fail. They absolutely daren't fail. And if things don't go right, go to the roof and jump off.
Yeah.
All these sort of things. There's so many suicides and stuff.
Yeah.
Look, this one-child policy from an emotional point of view has been just absolutely tragic. Yeah. Absolutely tragic. There are some good ones that come through, of course. Not everything is bad. But when I was doing my classes in my own home, well, not classes, tutoring, they called it, but I had a class of primary school children mainly, and there were a number of children there that had siblings or a sibling, and I'd hear the parents talking, and the parents would just say, "Oh, we just paid the fine," and let them get on with it and stuff like that. So, but listening to this lecture or whatever it was that all these people are talking, and I'm sure they know what they're talking about, but they don't know China. They really don't know China. They don't know what it's like to walk down the streets and to have beggars coming up to you with a baby in their arm and so forth. Mind you, I never gave money to beggars. I would take them to the restaurant and I would buy them a meal, but I wouldn't give them money because I don't know what pimp is behind them. Or the man that was sitting in the laneway with his trouser leg up above his knee and an enormous big ulcer on his leg. And when I said to the lady who had appointed herself my secretary, we need to help that man, her immediate reply was, Ria, there are so many people like that in China, you can't help them all.
Yeah.
I simply had one answer. I said, you're right. But right now, here, there's only one person and we are able to help one person. So the story was that there was a doctor who was treating him for free, but she couldn't buy the medicine for him. And so, long and the short of it was, we went to the hospital with him on his next appointment, and we just said to the doctor, what are the scripts? Give them to me. I gave them to my secretary, gave her a wad of money, and I said, go and find the medicine, and so forth. These are the sort of things. And they're talking about all this money here and all this money there, and these big things there, and these big things there. I know they're necessary and so forth, but none of it goes to the people who are lame, the couple who had their first child, and it ended up being 4 children, 4 identical boys, or 2 and 2 identical boys. They eventually, the money that they had saved up to have a child went through much quicker than the children were ready to come home. So they said, we have no more money, we're going to take the children home. And the youngest died, or the smallest died, before the next morning. And next morning there was an ambulance, and the children's hospital in the capital city had found out about it and came there and said, look, you've got to give us the children. We've got to make them healthy. But they are then left with a bill to the hospital, and I found out about it, and I had a Chinese partner that was helping me, and we had raised money for this couple. And so then I said, and many people had sent money to the television station, so they gave that money to him on TV. And the hospital accounting people were standing there. That wasn't on TV. Right, we'll have that money, thank you. And I said, well, if I give him money, will that be taken off him too? And they said, yes, any money he receives goes to the hospital first. So I said, okay, we won't give him any money. It's as simple as that. So I had some friends who had a car, and they drove me to their home, which was about 6 hours away or so forth. And we went there after the babies had gone home. And I simply said, okay, who do you owe money to? And we just repaid some of his debts.
How long ago was that?
That he had, like the whole village had put in money for these 4 little babies, right? And so we took the... I said, no, I won't give the money to you. I'll give it to them. You just tell me who to give it to. And he said, okay, 5,000 to this one, 5,000 to that one, and so forth until the money had run out. But it's those people that are missing out. And until China gets that in order, quite frankly, I don't have any praise for how much, I don't care how big a city they build. Shenzhen is an enormous city. I have no time for it until they look after the ones that are at the bottom. They get no help at all. Here, at least, they have an invalid pension. It might not be much, but at least it will give them a meal, whereas they have to beg or scrounge.
Well, how long was that?
It's just so sad.
Sorry, how long was that?
How long ago?
How long ago?
I was in China from 92 till 2012.
Long time ago.
Okay.
No, it's not a long time ago. 8 years.
Yes, it is. It's a long time. Long time in a country like that.
Yeah, but it doesn't. But it hasn't changed much. I've got enough contact still a lot of people.
I think in China, more people have been brought out of poverty than in the rest of the world put together.
Well, with the amount of poverty they had, I'm not surprised.
Yes, so
It's
coming
very
from all
difficult
over.
for the rest of the world to have that much poverty.
Well,
But,
the rest of the world does have that much poverty, Ria. Has more poverty.
Well, I mean, in the world.
When did you last visit an Indian village or an African village, Ria?
I have not had the privilege to go to Africa.
No. Well, poverty is not a native only to China.
But we're not sitting here. We're not sitting here saying how wonderful China has done and listening to people who say they're doing this and they're doing that. I know they're doing all that, and it's all wonderful. If some of it goes down, instead of the high officials' kids going to America to study.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can I say something, Albert?
Yes, please.
This program is about China's economy. One of the speakers earlier on, I thought he said China is transitioning out of manufacturing and moving into self-contained service industries. From an economic point of view, I found that rather strange. Did you hear that? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, you hear that correct, and I think that's wrong. Because for all services, the service have to service the real economy.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought. I thought that
so
very well.
I agree with you. I find, although, these are so-called experts, okay? They have their own prejudice and their own point of view. So we have to keep in mind that we might not agree with every one of them. So, for example, this one, you correctly point out, I don't agree. I think a service economy is only as good as the fundamentals of the economies are right. Of course, I understand that some service economy is very important. For example, I'm a teacher. Teaching is also a service economy. Or in the healthcare sector, it is also a service economy. These are essentials. But if we cannot have sufficient food on our table, my teaching is useless. So you need something really running on the background. The real economy has to be sound first before you talk about service economy. So that's why I think, well, that person I don't agree. China has already in many times stressed that the service economy will only service the real economy. I think that is their national policy. Yes, okay. Sam?
No, it was illogical, I thought.
Yeah. Yes, Sam?
Sam, you're muted.
You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes, in some way, it looks like it's our normal people that, I also have some sense that the industrial, that is good. And then John Gone, is it John Gone?
Yeah, John Gone in the video, yes.
And Tanger, which is the China will withdraw away from the production and service to others. These statements seems right, but also wrong. The right ones, let me see, whatever you already know what is wrong. But currently that China has some other different view already, because China has always has some 5-year plan continuously. Whoever down there, it doesn't matter, but the plan is already there. And the one which is looking around, that's another new economical situation. The area will be in the Hainan area. It's not the southeast South China Sea. It's a Hainan's island. That is one thing. another one is what would be the Qingdao or Dalian section.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that the high speed which is going through to that Dalian to Yanqiang
Yantai.
section.
Yeah.
Now, all these ones still have to go back to the fundamental the technology. You know that the China has maybe 2 years ago, I heard from Albert Yu, that China is going to the more quantum system. And that Huawei is 5G,
yeah,
and then it's going to the 6G. So that kind of a technology going up there. And then in Peking, normally people just gathering around for the food. But it's and so about 5 years ago, it already is not a breakfast gathering, but it's a breakfast gathering for discussing the technology for the young people. And that created to the different situation at now. And they are going to have a more and more on the technology, more advanced on that one. And then that's why the industrial production may not have to be concentrated in the China. It might be taken away to the Southeast Asia, to the India, Southeast Asia, and some other country.
Yeah, that
means
the actual production of the product might diverse to other parts of the world.
Right. Yes.
And now there's a very at the moment, United States very rich because it has a lot of technology, and they sell technology rather than sell products, and that's how you make a lot of money. For example, Apple, yes, it sells a product, but the product is made by Chinese. The bulk of the profit of that product is earned by Apple, not earned by the Chinese, although Chinese make the phones. So that is the kind of
$1,000.
Yeah, and so that is the kind of economy China might want to go into. But I will caution that this can be very dangerous. If eventually people can catch up, and then once you catch up, and unless you keep on investing into the innovation, so but innovation needs on the ground experience of how the product is made. So that is a very subtle philosophical arguments, which I don't think I want to go into this today. Maybe later sometimes we can go into a deeper discussion about philosophical economy. But anyway, any other question? Sorry.
Excuse me, my phone's ringing. Excuse me.
Okay.
You are excused.
Anyone else? No?
Albert,
no, I hope I get to go to China next year. I couldn't
good.
go this year. It all cancelled, so I hope I can go next year.
Yeah, I also hope I can go to China next year as well. I'm really looking forward to go back to Hong Kong.
I have to see where we have something that's safe.
The head of Qantas has just said there'll be no international flights by them from Australia till at least December next year. So I don't think
December next year.
They may make a bubble with China because it's disease free, and you might be lucky.
I don't think we can look that far ahead.
Well, you are if you're saying you don't
have no,
China next
we have
year.
no idea what's going to happen for the next year, and so I'm just hoping.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some.
But I'm not buying a ticket yet.
You won't be allowed from Qantas.
I wouldn't like Qantas anyway.
Yeah, Qantas is saying that December of the 2021.
Oh.
To there. Otherwise, no flight to anywhere.
Okay. Anyway.
Okay, folks. Well, bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye, Albert.
Okay. Finish for
Thanks,
today.
Albert.
Okay.
Bye.
See you next week then.
Thanks, Albert. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
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 Goodbye, Albert.
Bye bye.